Photoshop gives us the ability to change the color mode in our photographs, and the modes are located under Image. You'll see here we have multiple choices: bitmap, grayscale, duotone, index color, RGB, CMYK, lab color, and multi-channel. And then we also are showing the bit depth for each channel. And there aren't many occasions where you're going to want to or need to pay attention to the bits per channel, so we're really not going to look at those or go into any detail with those. Same with lab color and multi-channel. 99% of the time you'll never use those. So the ones we're going to focus on primarily are CMYK, RGB, and grayscale, and then I'll also show you duotone and bitmap. So you'll notice that by default the photograph we have here is in RGB color, and that's typical most of the time. And for any web work that you're doing, most of the time RGB is fine. In a few rare occasions, especially if you want to create an animated GIF image, GIF, you will want to switch it to index color. But quite honestly, those are falling more and more out of style, and so it's a very rare occasion where you would actually use index color. The difference between RGB color and index color is that with index color, it actually tracks the colors that are being used in the image, and you can control how many colors are being shown at any given time, as low as perhaps 8 colors up to 256. So if we choose index color, you'll notice that I can select how many colors I want it to show. And if I go with, let's change it. Rather than go with 256, we could change it to 16. They also have some presets, but we're not really going to pay attention to those. So I'm going to change it just to 16 colors, and when I click OK, watch what happens. So the image has changed some, and everything that you see here is one of 16 colors. That's it. Okay, as opposed to if I change it to, say, 8 colors. This is 8 different colors, and essentially it looks like it's just different shades of the same color, right? And the same is true if I change it to, say, 256 colors. It has more to draw on, and so it look closer to the original. Matter of fact, you can't see much of a difference at all. But in most cases, you really won't need to use index color at all. Now, CMYK is another story. If you are using any kind of illustration, photograph, anything that's created in Photoshop for print, ultimately that file will need to be converted to CMYK. And to do that, you just simply select CMYK color. It will show you what the default color profile is, and in most cases you can use that default profile. We're not going to take time in this series to get into different color profiles and what they mean, but in 99% of the cases that you'll encounter, US web coded version 2 profile is perfect for what you're using. Essentially, this defines what most printing presses are running these days. So I'm just going to click OK, and you'll notice that really nothing has changed. The only thing that will change is that there's certain colors, like really bright blues, for instance, or super bright greens, that can't print in a CMYK process. The range for commercial printing is limited to a certain extent, and so it'll change those colors to the nearest color safe version of that particular color. And you can notice that really well if you bring up the color palette. You notice here, if I click in these reds, or you know what, let's go to green. Notice how with this bright green that I have selected here right now, see where there's an exclamation mark over this version here? What this is telling you, it's related to our CMYK process. It's telling you that this current version, this color that I have chosen, won't reproduce correctly in a CMYK environment. And so if you are designing or creating something that's to be for print and you're filling with a specific color, what you want to do is click on the color underneath the exclamation mark, and it'll reset that color to a web, and I mean by web, I mean printing web, by a CMYK print environment. It'll reset that so that now you know that it's safe. If I come up here and select another color that isn't CMYK safe, you'll notice that the alert shows up again. Okay, so it really gives you an idea of what will work and what will not work in a CMYK environment. Whenever you convert from RGB to CMYK in a photograph, it automatically detects any of the colors in the entire scene that may be out of bounds for the CMYK process and converts them to its nearest counterpart that's printer safe. Okay, so that's basically what's happening. In most cases, however, you really won't see any difference or any change in your photograph or design at all when you switch to CMYK. And then once you have it switched, you can see now the mode is listed as CMYK. Then you can save your image as a TIFF in most cases for print. Now, the next option that we have for modes is grayscale, and it's pretty much what you think. It turns a color image into a grayscale one, but it isn't the same as desaturating an image, and we're going to look at that in the next video. It literally strips all of the color information out of the image so that it's now just varying shades of black, okay, which is different from a desaturated color image. So there's a lot more information in a desaturated color image and it'll reproduce differently, whereas a grayscale image is one that you would use like if you're printing a newspaper in just black and white. That might be a good use for black and white image this way, or a grayscale image. And so all of that color data is gone except for just the gray, varying shades of gray. Once you have an image in grayscale, that opens up a couple other options, and that's bitmap and duotone. Bitmap you will likely never use. It essentially takes your grayscale image and reduces it down to either black or white. And if I click on it, it asks for our output resolution. The method of diffusion, the default, is normally what you'd want to use. And if I click OK, you can see what happens. And if I zoom in, it's just blacks. It's either black or white and varying degrees of dots. And so it kind of looks like a pixelized version of our image. But again, unless you're looking for some kind of a specialty technique, you'll never use that option. And then the final option is duotone. And if I click on that, it gives us the ability to select two different colors to create, or in some cases, depending on the option that we choose, more. But if I choose duotone, our first color here is black. We can select a second color, say a brown, and you'll notice that whenever I selected the brown, how it affected the image. So now the image is a combination of the brown and the black. Now you also notice these angles here on the right, or on the left, excuse me. If I click on those, these are actually curves that allow us to tell how much of the color is going to show up in a given area. So like if I want the midtones to be darker, I can increase the curve in the middle here, and you'll notice that at 50% it's increasing to 66.3 right now, as opposed to if I come up here and drag it back down, you'll notice that those numbers are dropping and the colors are changing as well. You can also go in and modify these manually. Okay, so in many cases you'll use a lesser version of the color than you would the black. They also give you some presets that you can choose. Like you can see here, warm gray 8, black 1, warm gray 8, black 2, so on and so forth. So like if I choose, say, warm gray 8, black 3, so warm gray 8 is this color here, and then black is the primary driving color. And you can see how just by selecting the different options that are available, how it literally changes the appearance of the image. And so the image is being made up by just these two colors. Like how the original was RGB, then we converted it to CMYK. This version is now made up of just black and magenta. That's it. Okay, but let's say that we choose, well, probably not that. Let's say we go with cool gray 7 and we really like that look. We can click OK. then what I usually do, because it's so easy to print in full color process, either on an inkjet printer or on a digital printing press or whatever in CMYK, I almost always convert my duotone back to either RGB or CMYK, depending on the use that I'm using. So let's say for this instance, we're just using it for on the web. So I'm going to click RGB, and again, it converts it back to RGB, even though now it's just a duotone image because we stripped out that extra color. Okay. Now I'm going to show you how to achieve a similar result using some of the other tools, the adjustment tools, in the next video. Photoshop provides us with a number of tools that allow us to adjust the image itself, regardless of whether it's a photograph or a graphic design that we're creating. If we click Image and come down below where the adjustments layers were, you'll notice that we have image size, canvas size, image rotation, and trim. I want to take a look here at image size because it's one that you're going to use quite a bit. You'll notice that right now our image is set to 5760 pixels by 3840. Let's switch this over to inches just so we have a slightly smaller set of numbers to work with. So right now our resolution is set to 72, and if we want to say increase or decrease our number, say we want to scale it to 50 inches, you'll notice that it automatically adjusts the height because our little chain here is clicked. If I unclick that, it'll adjust each of the width and height independently of the other. Okay, so if I go back to say 50 and choose OK, it will resize the image. You also notice that resample is checked and it has automatic, but they also give us a number of other options: preserving details, which is primarily enlargement, bicubic sharper, because when you take a large image and start to reduce it, it does make it a little bit blurrier. So we could either go with automatic and let the program sense which one makes the most sense, or we can choose one that we feel based on experience works best. If we don't want to resize the image but just change the dimensions, watch what happens if I unclick resample. Okay, you'll notice that if I change the resolution from 72 to 300, it automatically reduces the size of the image. And why is that? Well, it's still the same number of pixels. You notice the dimensions at the top haven't changed. So all that you're doing is resetting what the resolution is. You're not affecting the size. If I choose resample and let's say we go with 72, okay, you'll notice now the pixels have changed, 1382 by 922. So we're literally resizing the image under those settings. Now you might ask, why does that even matter? Well, it can matter in some pretty interesting ways, because depending on the image that you're working with, it gives you a way of adjusting the resolution without needing to scale it up or lose anything. You can actually find out how much of your image resolution you have to work with if you're moving, say, from web to print. Okay, so like if you have an image that's say 1800 pixels, if you divide 1800 by 300, you're going to end up with 6. So at 300 dots per inch print resolution, your image is going to be 6 inches wide. Okay, and like with this image here, let's just reset this for a moment. At 72 pixels, which is screen resolution, and we set this to images, this image is 80 inches wide, 80 inches. If we turn off resampling and change our resolution to 300, it's now 19.2 inches high. We haven't removed any pixels. It actually just makes it sharper, but the width and the height is different. And so that's where it comes into play. It really depends on what you're after. Now, in some cases, you may have an image that you want to scale up that's smaller than you prefer, and you need to scale it up a little bit larger. And that's where it can make sense perhaps to use like bicubic smoother or preserve details, depending on the type of image that you're working with. We also have canvas size. Now, canvas size works different from image size. Canvas size starts with the current size of the image that you have, and you'll notice you have the little arrows here. So let's say that I actually wanted to make this image taller or add additional canvas space to the image, say at the bottom. Okay, so I can change the height from 53 to say 70 and choose the anchor point to be top center. So what that tells the program is that the additional length that I'm adding should just be applied to the bottom. If I click the bottom center, it's saying that it should be applied to the top. And then as the program extends the canvas, I can actually choose how it does that. Do I want it to use the background color, the foreground color, white, black, gray, or other? Okay, so in this case, I'm probably going to choose black. So what happens when I click OK, it extends the canvas with the black color, and then the original photograph is here. So now it's higher than what it was before we applied the canvas setting. And I found very often, just as a side note, that if you're working with photographs especially and you want to extend the canvas, it's usually not a bad idea to make a copy of your background image first. And we'll just left mouse click and drag it down onto the create a layer button here at the bottom. And then whenever we apply canvas size, let's just make it a little bit smaller, it still has the same end result, but you'll notice now the original photograph is preserved without any, the color added. And so there's an advantage to approaching it that way. In that same area, we also have image rotation, and this gives us the ability to rotate the image, a full 180 degrees, so just rotate it around, 90 degrees clockwise or counterclockwise, and arbitrary. Arbitrary is basically just entering in what angle you'd prefer, say 25. And do you want it to rotate clockwise or counterclockwise? Let's say clockwise. When I click OK, it rotates everything. Now, unlike transform, which we looked at earlier, transform just affects the layer. Okay, the layer that you're applying the transform to. The image rotation that we just applied affects everything, and you'll notice that. If I turn off the layer that we had created, you'll notice that it actually rotated the entire canvas and everything. Okay, and then it filled it in with white. So you want to make sure to use that distinction depending on the end result that you're out to achieve. Another option that we have that isn't actually available to us unless we have a selection made is crop. And what it will essentially do with the selection made, if I choose crop, it will crop to just that selection, and you'll notice how it did that. Next we have trim, and trim has some uses to it that can come in handy depending on the types of images that you're working with and other layers. And let me give you an example. Let's copy this background so that we have an additional layer, and I'm going to make it a little smaller so it's easier to see this. And then I'm going to use transform to just scale up the layer. And so you notice that, let me just turn the background off here. You'll notice that I can move this layer around because of how I scaled it. So let's say that I want it to just fit into this area. So by fitting it into this area, we have all this extra part of the image over here to the left. See, it's still there if I slide it over. But if I come up to image and choose trim, what it will do is it gives us the option. We can choose based on transparent pixels or the bottom left corner or whatever. We can determine how it trims. And essentially it's kind of like taking a pair of scissors and cutting off all the excess. Okay, so the default is a top left pixel color, and that's what we're going to use. If I click OK, watch what happens to the image now. Now when I move it, notice that all that excess is gone. Okay, so that's where it really comes in handy. In previous versions of Photoshop, I believe this was referred to as crop. Okay, but now it's called trim, and it's under this section here. Reveal all basically does the opposite. It actually, if we undo the trim, let me just undo that using history. If we come up to reveal all, you'll see that it resizes the image based on what was previously there. In other words, if I turn off the bottom layer and show the background, you'll see that it actually rescaled the entire image based on the larger size that I had scaled this layer up to. And then it just added the background color to make up the difference. Okay, so it's essentially the opposite of trim. Photoshop gives us powerful image adjustment tools that are available under Image and Adjustments, and you'll see there's quite a selection here. They are in groups. First section is based upon exposure of different types. The second affects color. The third affects how the color is handled within the image. The next two affect shadow and highlight. HDR toning is a part of that. And then the last section is a direct effect on color. We have desaturate, we're color shifting, and we're equalizing color. So let's look at each group here individually. First we'll look at brightness and contrast. And the controls are simple, and they do exactly what you would expect them to. If I move the slider for brightness to the right, it brightens the image. If I move it to the left, it darkens it. So it's pretty straightforward. And the brightening and darkening is global. So every pixel is treated equally. The same is true with contrast. The contrast increases the contrast or decreases the contrast in the image globally. So it doesn't treat certain sections of the image different than others. And you'll see later on as we get into these tools where that can be a significant part of your editing process, because some of the tools allow you to target just highlights or just shadows. And so please know that with the brightness and contrast, everything is happening from a global perspective. Okay. They also give you the option of using auto, where the software reads the image and then makes suggestions on how to correctly balance the image through brightness and contrast. And then if I click auto, you notice that it's processing and it changed the brightness slightly and it increased the contrast to 42. And so based on the algorithms in the program, this is what the program would consider a properly balanced image. Of course, in many cases, it's subjective, and we can tweak it to our heart's content to determine what we feel is most appropriate for what we have in mind for our photograph or our graphic. The next option that we have is levels. And levels takes brightness and contrast kind of to the next level, because we have a number of options available to us. You'll notice that in the top histogram area, we have shadow, midtone, and highlights. Then below we have output levels, which is very similar to brightness controls that we just saw. You also notice that there's a number of presets that allow us to achieve specific results, like increasing contrast, lightening shadows, and so on. And then we have channels where we can affect all three channels, red, green, and blue, simultaneously by adjusting the sliders, or we can just adjust one of the three, whichever one we choose. The last section that I want to point out here are the eyedroppers. And the eyedroppers give us a very pixel specific control. If I double click on this shadow eyedropper, you'll notice that right now all the values are set to black. And how that works is with the shadow eyedropper selected, if I click on a certain area of the image, let me move this off to the side, wherever I click, it resets that pixel value to whatever the value is for the eyedropper. So in this case, 100%. So if I click in this shadow area, it's going to reset the image based upon where I clicked. Okay. Now, if I click in a light area with the shadow, it's going to extremely darken it because it will take that lighter pixel and reset it to black. That's how the eyedroppers work. Okay. The same is true with the midtone and the highlight. And we have full control over what these values are. In other words, let's say I want to make my highlight area this part of the sky right here. Notice where it reset it to the light blue. Or, you know what, let's go with something a little more pronounced. If I click OK, and then with that eyedropper selected, click anywhere in the image, it resets that value to that blue. Okay, that specific pixel, wherever I'm clicking, it resets it to that value. So it really gives us a lot of control over how our shadows and highlights show up. Okay. So I'm going to hit cancel, and then we're going to open that again. Adjustments, levels. And let's take a look at this section of the levels. First we have shadow. And the further we move the slider to the right, the darker the shadows go. Okay. The further with the highlight, the further to the left, the brighter the image gets. And then of course with the midtones, it affects the middle range of pixels. Now, a couple things to keep in mind when you're working on an image, especially a photograph. Right now, the histogram that you see here is pretty much ideal for this photo because the object of the game is to not have any of the dark area or the light area slammed up against the edges. Now, if you move the sliders to the left or to the right, you'll notice that if you draw a vertical line straight up, all of the pixel ranges from 14 pixels and to the left, those values are now solid black. And the further you move to the right, it's saying that all of the pixel values from 0 to 29 are now solid black. And that's why your image is naturally darkening. Same is true with the right. Right now, the absolute value of 255 is 0% any color. So it's pure white. So the further I move this slider to the left, what it's saying now is all the pixels in the image from number 229 clear up to 255 are now reset to white. That's really what's happening. It's not just a matter of sliding the slider one way or the other to brighten or darken the image. There's actually specific math that goes on behind it. Now, with the output levels, it handles things in a different way. It actually handles them more globally. It ignores highlight, midtone, and shadow. And it functions very similar to contrast and brightness combined. Like if you combine those two together, output levels works very similarly. And you'll notice that you still have the values of 255 and 0, but it functions opposite what happens up here. So in other words, as I move the slider down and we get to the lower numbers, notice how everything is darkening, and it's doing so in a very even level way. Same is true if I move the slider up from the left, it's lightening everything globally. And you can see how it's very obvious here. So you can actually use the two settings in conjunction with each other to lighten or darken your image, either globally or a little bit more specific to the midtones. Okay, and if you wanted to, let's say that the blue was a little bit out of whack here and we wanted to focus on just that, we can select a new channel. Instead of RGB, we could come up and select just the blue channel. And now you'll notice that first of all, the histogram has changed. But if I move the slider for the midtone, all that's affecting is just the blue. Now you notice that the image is getting more green or less green. That's because it's adding blue, because I'm moving it to the left, or subtracting blue so that the yellow and the red and the green together shine out more predominantly. So it's affecting the colors that way, but only the blue channel. Okay, so you could literally go in and tweak, say just that part of the blue channel, then we could come up to the green channel and maybe increase the green this way, or maybe cut it back a little, make it a little darker. And then choose, say, the red channel here. And you notice the further I move to the left, the more red it gets. More to the right, how it gets more blue and green. So you can actually adjust the image that way as well. It's a little more specific channel to channel. And if you compare it to the original, you can see where we actually warmed up the rock a little bit, but the sky is pretty much identical to what it was. So that's the benefit of working with levels in that way, is that you can actually increase contrast some or decrease it using the output levels. And then, of course, even though we've made adjustments in each of these channels, we can also make adjustments globally on the RGB. So I can darken the whole midtone area of the image if I want to. Okay. Next, we have curves. And curves works very similar to levels, except in a lot more precise detail. Whereas curves, we were presented primarily with shadow, midtone, and highlight. Curves, we can get very specific. We can go focus in on a specific tone. You'll notice how it's sharing down here where it says input and output. It's actually telling you the pixel number that I'm on as I go down this scale. And again, you can affect either RGB or just the red, just the green, just the blue. It also comes with presets as well. And just to kind of show you how it works, we're not going to spend a lot of time in this, but if I say click on this point right here, which is at 190, I can drag this down and it's just affecting this image based upon where I'm dragging it down. If I drag it to the left, it's brightening it. But notice how the curve is adjusting. So it's just a different way that I can go in and get specific. So maybe I want this value down here in the darker register to increase in brightness a little bit. But I want to maintain the highlights so that they don't blow out. By using the curves that we have here, we can get very specific on how different tones of the image are being affected. And of course, you want to use it carefully because you can extremely mess up an image. Okay? Like I could bring this value up like this and now all of a sudden it's kind of funky, which you may think that's cool. But obviously, you know, the primary function of this is to actually retouch images in a certain way. Okay? The next tool that we have in this particular section is exposure. And exposure, again, it is a global tool that affects everything equally. If I move the slider to the right, it just increases brightness, contrast, everything simultaneously. Okay? Offset controls how it's affecting the shadow area. Gamma correction affects how the pixels are being influenced by the exposure, again, across the board. If I choose, say, -2 under the preset, it globally shifts the exposure by -2. So if you take a picture and say it's slightly underexposed, you could come up and choose +1, and it'll just increase the exposure, which there can be some extreme advantages to that. Say everything else is fine, the color, all of that is fine, the contrast even, but you just want to bump up the exposure. That's really where this tool comes into play. Okay, and again, you can go in and be specific with the eyedroppers and control just certain sections of it as well. Okay, so you can see where the offset is being affected. And what it's doing is it's preserving the pixels that I clicked on from the eyedroppers. Okay, the next set of adjustments we're going to take a look at is the color enhancement section. First we have vibrance, and vibrance is a function of brightening the color, but it works differently than saturation. First of all, with vibrance, as we move the slider to the right, it will increase the colors just subtly. The whole object of vibrance is to maintain the pixel integrity of the image, but just boost the color slightly. So it functions primarily with the color areas in the highlights and a little bit in the midtones, whereas with saturation increases the color globally. So you'll notice that everything is getting more saturated, brighter, all of that together. There are some occasions where saturation can make sense to increase your color slightly. I use vibrance all the time in just giving my photographs a little bit of an extra kick. Like if you're taking pictures in the fall and the trees have color in them, just increasing the vibrance a little bit will still allow the photograph to look real, but just boost up those colors. And there's advantages to doing that because our camera sensors can't always record the colors as we see them. And so tools like vibrance and even saturation give us the ability to add some of that brightness and snap back into our colors. The next tool is hue and saturation. And saturation in this configuration works exactly the same. The lightness control works exactly the same as we saw in levels, the bottom area that we saw in levels. The big difference in this tool is working with hue, and this literally gives us the ability to shift the color scheme globally. So if I left mouse click and drag the cursor to the right, it shifts the hue of the entire image. So all the pixels are being affected accordingly. Same way if I go to the right. And you can achieve some pretty cool effects this way. Even if you're working in graphics and not photographs, a hue shift can really come in handy as well. And once again, you can affect the hue in just individual color schemes or across the board with the master. Now with saturation together with hue, it allows you to brighten the colors or desaturate them. The more you move the slider to the left, the less color shows in the original image. The more you move it to the right, the more color shows. And then lightness, again, is a global brightening or darkening of the image. Now there's another feature in hue and saturation, and that's colorize. It's off by default. And if I click it and turn it on, essentially what it does is it applies a single color to the overall picture, very similar to what we saw with duotone, except this is just on one color. And we can choose what that color is by moving the hue throughout the range, and you'll notice that the color corresponds to what you're seeing in this on the rainbow slider here. And then you also have control over how it's being applied from a saturated perspective. So if I have a black or a full color picture and I want to just turn it to say an orange like this, colorize gives me the ability to do that very easy. And by the way, it also works equally as well using black and white photographs. And of course, as always, there's presets that you can achieve specific effects, like if you want your photograph to look like a cyanotype, you can click that preset and it automatically sets everything so that it appears that way. There are also, let's say you have a certain setting that you really like a lot and you want to keep that, you can actually save that preset. And if you click save, it'll give you the ability to name that preset, and then it'll store it up here in this area so that you can go back to it and just apply it over and over again to your image. The next tool we have is color balance. And color balance gives you the ability to make color tweaks to the different areas, shadow, midtone, and highlight. So you notice right now midtones is selected. Let's say that I want to just affect the color shading on the shadows. If I click shadow, you'll notice that I have a cyan, magenta, yellow, red, green, and blue. And the more I move the slider to the left, the more yellow is introduced into the shadow area. If I move it to the right, the more blue is introduced to the shadow area. Same with the magenta versus the green, cyan versus red. So you can get very specific with these. If I choose highlights, it's primarily going to target the lighter areas of the picture. Okay, so using these three levels, midtone, highlight, and shadow, you can get very specific in adjusting certain parts of your photograph or image in a way that the other tools can't mirror. Okay, and then once you're happy with how they appear, you can just click OK. The next tool in this section is black and white. And the black and white is different than what we saw with grayscale. It's also different than desaturate because you have the ability to control how the black and white is being converted. And what I mean by that is, remember back when we all used film. If we were shooting with black and white film, putting a filter on the front of our lens controlled how the light was striking the film. And so as a result, if we had a red filter on, the landscape appeared one way versus if we had a green one on. Well, this set of controls mimics that exact same process. So for instance, on this particular picture, if I increase the blue, you notice that because there was a lot of blue in the sky, it starts to blow the sky out, but it really doesn't affect the other areas that much. Same with the red. If I increase the red, because there's red in this area of the rocks, it actually starts to lighten it up or darken it. So it gives me the ability to control how the black and white is being converted based upon these colors. Okay, and there's also presets, and you can see like high contrast blue filter. It's blowing out the sky almost completely, but you can see how the settings are set. Same with high contrast red or infrared. If you wanted to mimic the effect of infrared, you could choose that preset. And so literally, regardless of whatever photograph or image that you're working on, you can control exactly what is being shifted into the grayscale arena at the different color levels. So if you have a picture, let's say, that has a lot of yellows in it, you may want to preserve those whenever you're converting it to black and white. And so that may mean turning the yellow section back, but enhancing the blues. If, let's say, that there's a really strong blue sky, by moving the blue slider to the left, you can darken the sky, but keep the tonal range of every other part of the image completely intact. So that's the power of working with the black and white conversion part of the sliders here. Next, in the color adjustment section, we have photo filter, and this is kind of similar to the conversion process, except that, again, when we used film, there were different kinds of film. Like there was daylight film, there was tungsten film, and if you use daylight film indoors, the end result tended to look a little on the cool side or a little blue. And to compensate for that, we would screw different types of filters, again, onto the front of our lens, like a number 85 warming filter or a number 81. And we could also achieve special effects using different filters that we would add to the front of the lens. These photo filters essentially work the same way. Okay, so you notice if I apply the cooling filter 82, it globally affects the entire image as if there was an 82 filter on the front of your camera. Same with green, okay, or deep red. And you would think, right, that it would just be bam, there's this deep red, but you notice that you can control the density. So you have control over how much your image is being impacted based on the filter that you're choosing, because it may just be a subtle shift that you want to make. You know, like let's say we want to warm this up a little bit, say with an 81 warming filter. You'll notice that if I move it to the right, it warms it up a lot. And by warm means shifts it to the yellow versus the blue. So maybe I just want to shift the image slightly, say 23%. You'll notice if I click the preview on and off, how it just appears a little bit more bright with the warming filter applied. The next filter in this section is Channel Mixer, and Channel Mixer isn't a setting that you'll probably use very often. It just gives you the ability to shift the red, green, and blue channels in some pretty funky ways. And again, there's presets, and you can achieve similar results like you did with some of the other filters. Like if I choose black and white with an orange filter, it's just a different form of conversion process. But in this case, instead of converting the image based upon what we used to use as normal filters, like red, green, blue, and yellow, and so on, it makes the conversion happen based upon the RGB channels, the red, green, and blue channels that exist in web-based images. So it's very similar in some respects. In other respects, it's completely different. And of course, you can also use it to enhance the colors just from a red, green, or blue perspective as well. So you're probably starting to get the idea that you have a lot of control over how your image appears. And the last one is color lookup that we're going to look at. And this is one that you're likely never going to use ever. And it's totally based on color profiles that really have very little to do with most of the work that you're going to be working in. The next section of image adjustments that we're going to look at are the ones in this section here that affect the color in different ways. The first one is invert, and it's pretty straightforward. It takes the colors that you see in your image, whether it's color or black and white, and it inverts them. Pretty much like that. So it creates a negative, essentially, of what your image is. And it's a very selective option. You're not going to use it on a daily basis, most likely. It's good to know that you have that available. One application where I can see it be very effective is if you're working with a graphic that is just black and white. And if you select the invert, it'll just switch those options from one to the other, from black to white, white to black. And therefore, it can save you a lot of time. So I'm going to undo that, and we'll take a look at the next adjustment, which is posterize. And posterize basically takes the colors in your image and averages them down to basic levels. And you can see here the default bottom level is level 4. The more I increase the slider, the more back to the original form that the picture becomes. It's very similar to what happens whenever you save an image as a GIF using the selective option that we looked at in one of the previous videos, except that instead of saving it here, you're just reducing the color. And it's a very specific effect. That here's level 2, which is at the extreme left. So it's just another way of reducing color information to achieve a special effect. Again, it's not a tool that you're going to use on a regular basis, but it could have some very specific limited uses. Next, we have threshold. Threshold I actually use a lot more, and the reason why is because it converts all the pixels in your image to either white or black. But what's cool about threshold is that you have control over which pixels get converted. So the more I move my slider to the left, the brighter the image becomes. We're averaging again based on the histogram. The further I move it to the right, the darker it becomes. So I actually have some control over creating a very high contrast image just based purely on threshold. Now I'll show you where this can actually come into play in a very interesting way. Let's create a layer, and I'm going to fill it to white. So I'm going to select white, and I'm going to choose Edit, Fill, and we're going to fill with a foreground color. And then the next thing I'm going to do is create, let's just create a rectangle. And I'm going to fill that rectangle to black. Okay, I'm going to hit Command or Control D to deselect the marquee selection, and I'm going to come to Filter and choose Gaussian Blur. And so you'll notice that the more I increase the slider, the more blurred our triangle becomes. So let's go with a setting, just randomly, something like that. Now, with this image here, okay, it's not a photograph, it's just a graphic, but if I come back up to Image Adjustments and choose Threshold, watch what happens. It actually sharpens the image, okay, but it does it based on the pixel values again. So again, the more I move it to the right, the more pixels are actually being made dark, which is why it's expanding, because remember, the original is out of focus. So by me moving the slider clearer here to the right, what it's saying is all the pixels from number 230 clear to 0, or clear to, yeah, to 0, are now black. That's basically what's happening. And if I move it the other way, you'll notice that it decreases in size, because what it's saying now is every pixel from number 251 all the way to 250, or from number 21 all the way to 255 is white. So it, again, it's creating an absolute in your graphic. But what's fun about that using threshold is that in some cases we may have an object that's a little bit blurry that we want to sharpen, and as long as it's black and white, just black or white, one of those two colors, threshold gives us the ability to do that very quickly, to sharpen it very quickly. But in the case of a photograph, threshold also gives us the ability to convert it into black or white, which can really lead to some pretty cool effects, as you would imagine. The next image adjustment is gradient map, and gradient map is kind of cool. Again, for special effects, what it does is it takes a gradient, like you see right here, black to white, which is the default, and it maps the tonal range of each pixel from 0 to 255 based on what the gradient is. So the default is black to white, so it looks like a normal black and white conversion. But what happens if you assign different colors to those same values? Well, I'll show you what happens. If we hit our drop-down menu and choose one of the default gradient maps that's installed with Photoshop, like this one here in the middle, it completely changes the look and appearance of our photograph, because now what's happening is it's telling the program, oh, by the way, pixel number 255, pure white, is now orange. And pixel number 0, pure black, is now purple. And all of these colors are assigned to each of those ranges of pixels. Remember, we've been talking about the histograms all along. where that becomes really fun is we can go in and edit this. So we have full control. Like let's say we want to have some yellow in the highlight area. I can click just where I would want to add that yellow and then click again. You'll notice that the color is selected. Come up, click on that color and get it to the yellow that I want. Click OK. And so now the pixels in that range are being affected. And if you have a color in here, say you added and you decide, you know what, I don't really like that a lot. If you left mouse click and drag down, it'll remove it. Okay, see how it's vanishing? And then the color is restored it again. And of course, you can use any of the presets, or you can create your own gradient as well. You can really do whatever you want with it. Okay, so you can get some really funky, cool effects just by swapping out the colors using the gradient editor in combination with a gradient map. Next, and the last one here, is selective color. And again, selective color is kind of interesting. I like this a lot because it allows you to go in and make adjustments to your image or your photograph based on specific colors only. So like if I choose, let's say blue, since we have blue in the sky here, if I move the adjustment sliders, the only color it's going to affect is the blue. And in this case, it's affecting it kind of subtly, except for the black would affect it slightly more dynamically. So it's a subtle adjustment in most cases. Okay. Same with like if I chose the greens, which we have as the trees here. You notice that I can adjust the appearance ever so slightly. It's a subtle change. Okay, relative and absolute is just how it affects the pixels, either globally or in relation to each other. So this isn't a dominant adjustment that you can use, but it's again a way of creating subtle changes. Like you'll notice here in the rocks, because there's red in the rocks, if I move the slider to the right, it softens the red and adds more blue. Same with the magenta. I can subtract magenta from it or add a little more to it. So it's yet another way of just tuning your image. The next set of adjustments that we're going to look at here in Photoshop are the shadows and highlights and HDR toning. And these are very specific for photographs and actually give you the ability to make some pretty significant changes to your photographs that otherwise you may not be able to accomplish. First, we're going to look at shadows and highlights. And the default setting here in Photoshop is to boost the shadows by 35%. And you'll notice that if I turn off the preview, it's affecting primarily just the shadow areas of the image. You can also darken the highlights here by a little bit just by moving the slider. I typically tend to drop this amount down to around 20 to 25%, but it's a way of increasing the shadows in a positive way so that it brings out additional detail in those areas that otherwise you may not be able to target. You'll notice that the mid-tone colors like the sky and most of the rock are virtually unaffected, just some of the darker areas of the rock. Now, you want to be careful when using this control and the next one as well, because it's very easy to push your photograph too far to where it looks unnatural, and unless you're after that effect. Now, this particular control does have more options. You'll notice here it says show more options, and it just gives you, it's the same controls basically expanded out in a really big way. So with the shadows, instead of the basic slider, you can control the tonal width, which is how it affects and interacts with the pixels in that range. Radius, again, is kind of like if you're adjusting the shadow pixels at, say, 0. The radius will expand it out to 30 or 50. You'll notice if I move the slider to the right, things start to get darker, more contrasty versus to the left. So it's kind of just how the calculations are made related to the photograph. Same with tonal width. You notice that it gets brighter or darker based on the slider, and it's only affecting the shadow. You can do the same thing with the highlights. You can even adjust the colors here at this level. It's a subtle adjustment. I don't know if you can even see it. You'll notice that the reds are slightly increasing the more I move it to the right. So you can really fine-tune your image in some pretty cool ways, especially related specifically to shadows and highlight areas, to enhance those particular regions. And the reason why it targets those regions primarily is that the sensors that are in our camera do really good with the midtone range, but it's usually in those exposures which are primarily targeting the midtones that the highlights and the shadows often go to the extreme one way or the other. And so this particular adjustment gives us the ability to pull some of that data back in and rebalance the photograph to how it actually appeared when we viewed the scene with our eyes. The next adjustment is HDR toning, and it does essentially the same thing at a much higher level. And I usually, when I use this, which isn't very often, I just stay with the default preset and then make adjustments accordingly. Essentially what's happening behind the scenes here is that you have your original photo. Then the program seamlessly creates two additional versions, one that's overexposed, one that's underexposed, and then overlays those three together to give you a greater dynamic range of exposure. So you notice where we're able to bring out a lot more detail in the shadow and in the highlights, and we can control how those blend together. You'll notice here where it says edge glow. So edge glow, one of those layers is actually out of focus that it applies to that, and it affects the exposure in some pretty cool ways. It helps get rid of a lot of extra noise that may be introduced into the image. And you notice if I move the slider to the left, look what happens to the rocks here versus to the right. You can see the changes that are happening. And you also can control the strength, which you'll notice that by increasing the strength, it's actually starting to sharpen the image. So there's a lot of behind the scenes math that's going on, but it's a fairly quick way to enhance your image and bring out some of those shadow details and highlights and boost color all simultaneously. Now, this same effect can be achieved by taking multiple pictures in camera and combining them together into one. This is kind of a cheat to mimic that effect, but in many cases, depending on your photograph, it can be very effective. Next, we have desaturate, and it's exactly what you think it is. When I click on it, it takes your color image and removes all the color out of it to just black and white. However, you'll notice that if we go up to image mode, the image is still RGB. So while it does remove the color from the image, it doesn't change it into a grayscale image, and that can be significant. Okay, especially if you're outputting in certain scenarios like for print. You're going to get a much richer looking image or photograph if it's RGB or CMYK and grayscale versus if you just converted it to grayscale. Okay, so let me undo that and let's take a look at the next adjustment. The next adjustment is match color. And match color is probably one that you won't likely use much. The primary purpose of it is if you have taken a number of photographs and you tweak one of them to where you like it, and you're working on other photographs that have a similar color and tonal range, you can actually use that previous photograph to globally adjust the new photograph that you're working in now. So I'm going to show you an extreme example. You notice here at the bottom it says source. So I'm going to, and the current source is none. So I'm going to actually choose the sunset image that we had of the windmill earlier as my source image, and watch what happens. It takes the color tonal range of that particular photograph and applies it to our source photograph here now, and resets and matches the colors to this image versus what was there for this one. So you can see in this case it's extreme and it doesn't give us a desirable result. But if we had a different version of, say, this one here, this photograph, let me just change that back to none, and we applied it in the same form, it would auto adjust everything in the photograph to match the target that we just imported. So it's especially handy if you're needing to retouch a lot of images that are very similar. It can save you a lot of time that way. But beyond that, it's very limited in its use. And of course, these image options up here just control how the color interacts with the image that you're seeing on the screen, the image that you're working with. Next, we have replace color, and replace color is a very handy tool. It's another adjustment that you may use a lot in certain situations, and here's how it works. You select an area that you want to affect. Like, let's say we want to adjust the sky and replace the color from its kind of drab blue gray that exists right now. So I'm going to sample that, and you'll notice here that it highlights in reverse in this area here. And fuzziness controls, it's basically a slider that controls how much of the tonal range is being affected based on the image or the pixel area that I selected. Now, what's really interesting about this is that you can add to or subtract from this initial selection just by choosing the eyedropper with the plus tool. If I click, say, this area here, you'll notice that that was added to the selection. If I go with the whites, that was added to the selection as well. And let's say I just keep eyedroppering until I'm sure that all of the various blues are selected. Now you'll notice that it's also sampling some values from the rocks, and that's because of the white area of the sky that I picked. So let's say I want to remove that. So I'm going to choose the negative eyedropper and just click on that area alone. And so it removes some of that from the rock. I can also control that some using the fuzziness. So just move that slider to the left. If I move it to the right, you'll notice it affects more of the image. But here's where this is so powerful. So you can see here is the default resulting color, okay, the average. If I come down here where it says replacement and start adjusting the hue, watch what happens. It affects the color of the sky. It's basically replacing its color, but none of the other image, none of anything that is black here is not being affected at all. So the only thing that's being replaced are the areas that are showing up in the white. If I move the fuzziness scale, you'll notice that it'll impact the image a little bit more. Okay, but I could actually, using the negative eyedropper, come over and remove some of those rock areas so that they don't show up. Let's just move this over here. So you can play around with where the subtle balance is based upon what you want to change or not change. And of course you can also affect the saturation and the lightness. So this can have some very far-reaching and fun options for you depending on the type of image that you're working in. So like we could start over and just say focus on the sky, or not the sky, the trees. And by the way, you can also turn your eyedropper into a plus by holding the shift key down. Notice how it turns into the plus by me holding the shift key down, or I can select it here. So now most of the sky is selected, or why do I keep saying sky? The trees. And you'll notice that there's some green in this area too, from moss and stuff. That's why that also showed up. So now I can literally change the color of the trees to any other color, and it's not affecting anything else in the scene except for the areas where there is green. So you can see how this could be really effective. You could actually use it, like if we switch over here to Dexter's Lab and choose Adjustments, Replace Color, I can select just the yellow and increase the fuzziness to make sure that I get just the yellow, and then come down here to Hue, and as I move the slider I can change his hair to pretty much anything that I want. And the more I increase the slider, the more it gets rid of the outlining that's happening. So it's a very powerful tool that can be used in a lot of different ways. And then we could also bring it up again and change the color of his gloves. So replace color can be very effective in adjusting some of the images and photographs that you're working on. The last one that we're going to take a look at here is, let's go back to our picture here, is equalize. And equalize really doesn't give you any controls. It just reads the image and decides, this is what I think looks best overall. Essentially, in a lot of respects, you could say that it's a combination of all the above, sort of, kinda, but when you click equalize, it just reads everything in the image and adjusts it automatically. And actually, I found that its adjustments are very good. This actually is a very appealing looking end result, and we can compare it to the original. You can see it's pretty dramatically different. And so, like, all the adjustments that I made over the course of us going through the adjustment tools, let's go back here to the original and apply equalize again. So you notice that it's based on what it sees at the time, because this looks different compared to what we had before. Okay, so see, this was the equalize that we applied first, and so it applied it to the image based upon the other adjustments that we had already made. So that's one thing to keep in mind whenever you're working with equalize, is that it works with what it has. It doesn't go back to the original source image unless you use it with the original source image. In this video, we're going to take a look at the transform tools that are available to us in Photoshop. And you'll locate these tools under Edit, and you'll see in this section here we have Content Aware Scale, Perspective Warp, Free Transform, and so on. The first one we want to look at is Content Aware Scale. This is a newer tool that's available in Photoshop. You'll notice right now it's not active, and that's because you can't apply it to just a background layer. So the very first thing we need to do is actually make a copy of the background. And to do that, I'm going to left mouse click and just drag it down to the little box right next to the trash can, which is Layer Duplicate. And now I have an exact copy of my background. So if I come back up to Edit, you'll notice that Content Aware Scale is now active. And the primary purpose of Content Aware Scale is to maintain the overall integrity of the image while allowing you to scale it unevenly in a certain direction. In this case, I'm going to scale it from the left. We're just going to scale it horizontally and leave the height as is. And something pretty magical happens as I start to scale from the left. You'll notice that the integrity of the windmill is remaining pretty much intact, but the program is automatically removing space from where the barn is and in the sky. And you'll also notice the same in the trees as well. And so as I continue to scale this over, it's just taking bits and pieces out of the original image and averaging it so that it still blends together well. And so right now I'm up to 2.5 inches that I've already scaled this image, and you'll notice that while the windmill is shifted a little further to the right, it's still pretty much intact, and the program is preserving that as well. Same with this area of the tree line. So the program is very aware from a content perspective and chooses on its own where to remove information to maintain the overall integrity of the photo. So if I hit enter to apply this and we compare it to the original, you'll notice that the windmill is nearly 100% intact. It's still a very attractive image. It's just that it reduced the size of the barn and the size of the trees, primarily over here on the right. Now there's a tiny little bit of artifacting right here at the top of the barn, but that could be easily smoothed out using the clone stamp or even a blur tool. So it's a very powerful tool. It's somewhat specialized. It really depends on the type of images that you're scaling. In other words, you likely wouldn't want to use it on people, but landscapes, architecture even, those types of photographs, it's perfectly suited for. Now the next tool that we're going to take a look at is also in this area, and it's called Perspective Warp. And the primary purpose of Perspective Warp is to straighten photographs that have angles in the architecture or in the landscape due to wide angle shots. If you're using a wide angle lens on your camera, whether it's a point and shoot, your smartphone, or digital SLR, and you aim up toward the top of a building like you see here, the lens tends to distort the angle of the building, so it doesn't maintain it perfectly vertical. As you see here, it's actually angled from the bottom to the top, facing toward the right. The tool that we're going to look at here, Perspective Warp, actually allows you to fix that in a very specific way. So whenever I select that tool, and you notice in this case I didn't have to make a copy of the background, although I could have, but the first thing I'm going to do is click over here on this part of the building, and it creates a mesh. And I'm just going to drag the points of this mesh so that it lines up evenly with this face of the building. And actually I'm going to go over to this corner edge here like so. Next thing I'm going to do is create a secondary mesh, and I'm going to click again, and I'm going to join it to this one. And you notice as I'm getting close to the corner, they highlight in blue, which means it'll auto snap. Okay, and then I'm going to position the mesh so that it proportionally corresponds to the building here. Now we're not affecting the courthouse in this particular building. This is the square of the town that I live in. I'm just primarily interested in straightening this building right now. And you'll notice on the right here, this building is also angled in. We could come back and fix that as well. So once we have our meshes in place to mirror the approximate perspective of this office building here, I'm going to come up to the top, and right now layout is selected, and I'm going to click on warp. Okay, when I click on warp, it gives me the ability to begin shifting the mesh so that I can actually straighten this building and just adjust it accordingly. And you don't have to go overboard with it. You can just adjust it a little bit. But let's say that I find that that's satisfactory. I hit enter. And if we come up here to history and you compare the two, this is before and this is after. So now you can see that the distortion that was created from the wide angle lens is now gone. Now of course, to make up that difference, it also warped the edge of the picture, but you could either crop the picture or fill this in using some clone stamping just to make up this difference. Okay, but it's a very easy way to straighten, especially architecture and certain kinds of landscapes. If you have tall trees and they're angling in because of a wide angle lens, this is the perfect tool, perspective warp, in order to fix those images. Now, next in the transform, we're going to look at the free transform tool. And to actually work with this particular tool, I'm going to switch back over to our actually, you know what, let's stick with this picture here, and I'm going to take the cartoon that we have here of Dexter, and I'm going to move it into this photograph. And so he's actually here in the corner. Okay, and let's say that I want the building and everything to scale down just a little bit. If I come up to Edit, Free Transform, this gives me the ability to scale disproportionately. I can scale up and down this way, horizontally and vertically. If I hold the Shift key down, it will lock the proportion. But if I right mouse click, you'll notice that I have access to all the other points. Right now I'm using Free Transform. Okay, but I also have the ability to choose Rotate, so that I could rotate the image if I wanted to. I can skew the image, okay, which basically just angles the image on either a horizontal or vertical line. I can choose Perspective, which you'll notice that both sides are angling in, depending on which angle that I'm choosing. And I can also even choose Warp. So that gives me the ability to actually expand some of the areas of the image by clicking on the center points. So it's as if it's warping plastic or something like that. So you have some definite control there over how it works. And you notice that you have the Bezier curve handles, and those are what you're using to actually shift this image. So I'm going to hit Escape to get out of that, and actually I'm going to work with a copy. And let's just come back here to transform. We went through these basic tools, but let's look at scale again. And I'm going to scale this down, and let me zoom in here so we can see this a little bit better. So we have this scale, we have our guy here. I'm going to set him over here on the street. He's kind of going, right? And I could actually use the same transform on him as well. Again, you'll notice if I choose Free Transform, I literally have the ability to change any of these. And I have instant access just by right mouse clicking. But let's say that I want to reposition him, like instead of having him as is, let's say that I want him facing the other direction. Well, we have flip horizontal and flip vertical. If I choose flip horizontal, it instantly flips him. So I could move him over here like this, put him in the middle of the road, and now he's facing toward the courthouse here. I can also take a look at maybe just let's see, we have the ability to rotate 180 degrees, 90 degrees clockwise, 90 degrees counterclockwise. In this case, we have no need to rotate, but these are set standards because people use them a lot. If you need to just rotate freely, you can choose that, and you can just rotate to whatever angle you need. And you'll notice that the degree angle that you're rotating is also being shown on the screen. You'll also notice that it's being shown up here in the top toolbar area, which is important. Another distinction is that if you hold the Shift key down, it will rotate it in increments of 15 degrees. Okay. The same is true with scale. If I choose Edit, Transform, Scale, you'll notice that I can scale him freely, or I can hold the Shift key down and he'll scale proportionately. And you'll notice that the width and the height percentages are also up here. You can lock them by clicking the little chain. And that way, however I scale, it's always going to scale proportionately. Okay, so you have a lot of control both here and in the top toolbar as well. And again, I can right mouse click and choose distort. And so now I'm going to unlock the width and the height. With distort, I can just take one corner and scale him that way, and the other three corners remain intact. Okay? And the same again is true with warp and perspective, and we looked at those already. So those are the transform tools. They're very powerful. You can use them in multiple settings, and you're going to find yourself using them in a lot of different scenarios. And as we go through these videos and get into some of the case studies, we're going to be using them as well in different scenarios. So you want to watch for those and really familiarize yourself with them.